This is the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm your host, Jim McDonald, and I'm going solo for this special episode. Jeff Stedman is on a much-deserved break, and we're recording on Christmas Eve. Today, our discussion will be focused on the recent SolarWinds Orion 9 code compromise, which has been in the headlines recently and affects many of our listeners in the IAM industry. I'm joined today by a repeat guest, Paul Volosen, who joined us last in episode 41, way back in April of this year. Paul is a fellow IAM practitioner and overall cybersecurity junkie. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Hi, Jim. Very happy to be on. Thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, we're glad to have you, and with everything going on in the news. But before we get into that, are you done all of your shopping?
I've done all my shopping in the sense that I've done no shopping. I myself don't have any children, but I have siblings and we're all grown up. So just being with each other and spending time is gift enough for all of us. So I guess I'm pretty lucky. I haven't had to do shopping for anybody else other than me in this particular season.
Yeah, I've done I do have to do shopping. I have kids and everything, and I found that I'm doing a lot of my shopping online. I'm trying to support the local businesses, so I'm going to go out and pick up a few things today. But yeah, it's that time of season, and I'm a procrastinator when it comes to this stuff. So yeah, I've got to do a few things today still. So for anybody who is celebrating Christmas or, whatever holiday you're celebrating, if it's coming around this time, I hope you are having a good one and enjoying it. By the time this episode rolls, it will be after Christmas. So on today's topic, Paul, tell us what's going on with the SolarWinds code compromise, which I've seen jokingly referred to as SolarGate or SolarGate.
Yeah, definitely. So it's really interesting. In my view, and this is just sort of my opinion, I think this is the, Pearl Harbor style sort of, it's not attack, intrusion in the sense that everyone is so caught off guard. So based on what we know so far, and this is looking at information from Microsoft and CISA and SONS and FireEye and others, what we know is that malicious code was inserted into a very popular network management system software called Orion, built by SolarWinds, which is from my home city, Austin, Texas. And so this compromised code or Trojan goes back to at least as early as March 2020 and was present in downloadable patches for the Orion management software until June 2020. So as part of that code, someone we suspect was a state actor was able to insert malicious Trojanized code, which ran on anyone that had that particular version installed, but the estimate is around 18,000 customers by SolarWinds. So this Trojanized software, because the services run as higher privilege elevated accounts, allowed the attacker to gain a foothold in the network and then kick off various other attacks as well against the organization. So it's a pretty big deal just because of the scope of potentially affected targets and also how much damage the attacker can do once they've compromised a network.
Yeah, and the whole concept of a Trojan horse is to kind of, look like a non-threatening type of code or patch or update and then hide malicious content in it, kind of dating back to the Trojan horse attack in the days of ancient Greece. So I always think that's interesting if you think about it, is like burying this code in something that seemed kind of innocuous, and really it's quite the opposite. So really what the attack was about was getting through that and penetrating networks and then getting in the door and setting up accounts. So I guess this is really an IAM type of issue, really, going in and setting up new accesses to networks. our listeners are fellow IAM practitioners. So can we talk a little bit? Can you talk a little bit about how this affects them?
Yeah, definitely. But I want to just go a little bit more detail on this particular attack because I just a little bit talk more about how it works because I think it's important to understand that and also understand the breadth of capabilities that it had. So, and just touch about a couple things you mentioned. So it's Trojanized in multiple ways. So one, as we mentioned, it enters the organization, the network through the Orion software. And then two, what I think is really sophisticated, it's got many anti-detection mechanisms. For example, it checks if you have any security tools running and it doesn't execute. It checks if it's running in a SolarWinds environment and it doesn't execute. It checks if it's running into a VM environment and doesn't execute. So there's a high level of heuristics that it checks to make it really, really hard. It checks, for example, one of the questions I had is why didn't somebody put a Wireshark trace on this and just see the data going out? Well, it's because it checks very simply if Wireshark is running and also all of Microsoft's anti or security tools. So that makes it really sophisticated in its anti-detection mechanism. And then the next stage, once it's in a target network, which is not SolarWinds, it's not a VM, it's not being inspected, it waits a period of time before it gets any data, but then it's able to perform operations, right? So some of those operations, as you mentioned, include account creation because the Orion software is running with high level of privileges. It's able to create accounts in the local system. It's able to use that to eventually gain access to a domain and domain admin or add accounts to the domain admin groups. That's one way that it's an IAM issue is that it compromises the identities of legitimate users in the organization.
Seems like Active Directory is really a main target for this malicious code. Is that right?
Yeah. So the ultimate goal of the attacker is really to exfiltrate data, in my opinion or in my view. And so to be able to do that, they want to gain as high level of access as they can. And often the on-prem is just a stage to the cloud-based attack. So once they've entered the network and the organization, they usually create a new account, which they will add to a domain admin group, for example, and then they'll gain access to the token signing certificate, which they will generate a new SAML certificate that they can use to access any sort of cloud federation trust that exists, and then enter that environment and then exfiltrate data, read emails, create new accounts. So this is a core IAM issue because it does have to do with with identities.
So Paul, I've been seeing a lot of press covering this and talking about the complexity of the attack. It seems pretty sensible from the standpoint of get in, kind of perform lateral movement, set up accounts, but they've kind of tied it back to a nation state attack. Everything I've seen in the news that it's likely from Russia. But given what we know about it, why did they draw that conclusion that it was a nation state behind this attack?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the conclusion is really because of a couple reasons. One, the sophistication requires a high level of talent. And two is what they did with it. So it looks like it's specifically targeted. It's not just causing damage for no reason, or it's not ransomware. So it's specifically targeted to organizations like FireEye, which you initially found it when their security tools were exfiltrated. And then it also targeted the Treasury Department, and it's also installed on most of all the military organizations. So it's very targeted. Microsoft identified, I think, a list of 40 customers, its customers that have been affected. But the list is a finite small list, and what it allows you to do is what's called attack, keyboard on attack, or attack on keyboard. So it really allows somebody remote control into the organization. So the level of sophistication, the targets, is what really suggests that this is a nation state actor.
Right. It seems like there's two things at play. One is kind of how they get in and how they move around, but then it's also how they're using that stolen access. Right. They're going in and getting access to email and things like that.
Correct. Yeah. So one of the capabilities that they're adding when they're forging these SAML certificates is being able to read emails. And yeah, that's one of the things that they're doing is a capability to read emails. So it's a very serious attack.
Yeah, it seems like one of the things that I've been reading a lot about is on the SAML side, if an organization is running an IDP, and the one that I've seen identified the most is ADFS, and I'm not sure if that's because the organizations that have been attacked in kind of a high profile way are ADFS users, but it seems like that the mode of attack has been to kind of take over the private signing certificates of those ADFS servers and then kind of impersonate users from a SAML perspective. Is that also what you've seen in your research?
Yeah. So once the on-prem network is compromised and there's a trust relationship with the cloud environment, if the attacker can get admin access, which is required to the on-prem environment, then they can get abilities to sign their own SAML keys, certificates, excuse me. They get the private key to create and sign their own SAML certificates, and then they can go to the cloud and perform any operation. So everything you said, is true. But the important thing I really want to point out is that the compromise has to be done through the on-prem system, and it's really an abuse of the SAML architecture. It's not a vulnerability in the architecture itself. It's just an abuse of it because the attacker through on-prem federation trust was able to abuse that privilege and then gain the right to do those operations in the cloud.
Paul, I've seen a lot of press where the number that you threw out there, 18,000 organizations affected by this. The ones I've been hearing about the most are United States federal government. I've also heard, a lot of high-tech companies and major multinational corporations. But I would imagine that, SolarWinds Orion was something used by other governments as well. Do you have any information on that? Has any of that been put in the news? Like what other nations besides the United States have been affected and are dealing with this at the moment?
Yeah, I know that there are other nations that are affected. The names don't quite come to mind, but as you mentioned, the customer base is so large. I mean, in the Fortune 500, I think it's like 425 out of 500 customers that have Orion software, and so the penetration by SolarWinds into the network segment is something that they have bragged about in the past. So it's definitely it's international, but I can't say the specific countries off the top of my head which ones they were that were known to be affected.
Right. What is kind of when you think about 18,000 organizations, so many, the attackers are probably focused on top targets first, but this is something that could be getting dealt with for a long time by a lot of organizations. I think the relevant question is for our IAM practitioners is, what should they be doing now? I would imagine a lot of this comes down to detection of whether or not there's an active attack underway within their walls.
Yeah, certainly. So the first thing I would really recommend is to follow vendor-specific guidance on how to first ensure that your configuration is secure. So, for example, Microsoft has very specific guidance on how to segregate your on-prem and cloud networks, how to securely access, how to set up access policies for on-prem and cloud, and how to make sure that they don't increase the risk of compromise. So you want to really follow vendor guidelines there. There's also tools from Microsoft that you can use to investigate anomalous activities. Of course, view logs. And there's also third-party tools that are coming out right now that can investigate anomalous activities on your network. So I think from a automated or from a basics prevention perspective is you want to go back and cross your T's and dot your I's on how you're deploying your environment and to ensure that it's secure. And there's a lot of documentation on that now. Of course, this is after seeing if you have a SolarWinds system on your network and making sure that you have the right patch and making sure that you have your Windows systems patched, that they don't trust any software that has the malicious code. So after the basics, good security principles there, you can look for specific activities that are just narrowly focused to IAM. So as we mentioned, one of the things it does is it creates new accounts. So you need to look in your environment for new accounts that have been created for particular identities and see if it makes sense for Paul who works in engineering, to have an additional account on the HR system. So some modern IGA systems can definitely, help with that through, say, account certifications, and those will tell you what new accounts have been created and allow you to take, action on them. But it won't, of course, show whether the account's been compromised itself. But if you can determine that an account's been compromised, so let's just assume that Paul's account's been compromised, what you should do is you should revoke access really to all of the accounts for that particular identity, because he may have access on 10 other systems. You should investigate the system which the access has been compromised to see what activities have been performed and what other systems might have been used with the compromised account. So that's kind of the investigation if you zone in on a particular account or identity that you think is compromised. And there's more that we can do, but I'll let you talk. I'll let you make a comment.
Yeah, no, it seems like some of this is basic blocking and tackling of a good identity governance program, really knowing when accounts are being created, and then privilege access. So if you have accounts that have elevated access, that your privilege access management system is discovering them. But if you're not very far along in your IGA journey, there's probably some limited help it can provide, but this ought to be maybe a wake-up call that, hey, we really need to get this IGA program moving. I kind of have been sitting here wondering about SolarWinds was, they deployed the software patch, and then that patch was able to go ahead and start creating accounts like you mentioned, domain admins. So I'm wondering, was it leveraging the SolarWinds service account? And is there maybe a potential problem that the SolarWinds service account is over credentialed, and that's what gives it the ability to kind of take these steps?
So the SolarWinds definitely runs as the service account, and from what I've read, I haven't used this particular software itself, but from what I read, it may actually have additional accounts that it runs in. Whether it's over privileged depends on, that would take an analysis of all the small privileges, subset of privileges that it has. It needs to be able to do network level operations. So it needs to be able to read the TCP/IP stack, I'm sure. And so that gets, you can't just run that as, I think, least user privilege. So that's a debate that's happening and starting to happen. That's a debate that's starting to happen within the industry from, are we giving software vendors too much access into our environment? I don't yet have an opinion on that because I haven't done my specific research on SolarWinds.
You make a good point, right? If Orion is essentially a network monitoring tool, it's going to need a certain level of privilege in order to do that network monitoring, right? So it's kind of a catch-22. It needs to have a lot of privilege to do its job, but at the same time, that opens up a potential security gap, if you will. So it feels like doing a fair amount of detection and monitoring of your environment, creating of new accounts, whether they're service accounts or administrative accounts. That's something that you can watch. Obviously, if you want to go back in time, if you haven't had all this monitoring in place, you mentioned going back through logs. And then, of course, also, if you're running kind of any on-premise IDP, knowing that that's kind of been the vector of attack is using a SAML IDP to impersonate accounts. Definitely look out for your vendor recommendations. But I think one of my other takeaways from this is kind of evolving. We're learning more about it. It's kind of like the coronavirus, right? We're learning more about it over time. And I'm wondering for our listeners, what are some resources that they should be tracking on or staying abreast of to just stay up to date as things are evolving within this? Where are you going to be looking to continue your research?
Good question. I'm mostly using the Microsoft resources. I think they are some of the best. I may be slightly biased because I've worked there before, but I think they really provide a really good detailed analysis and also recommendations on what to do if you're affected and how to investigate whether you're potentially affected. The DoD and NSA have also a couple of briefs out there, and CISA that are good. LinkedIn's also a great resource. So a lot of security folks are putting out content. I myself have frequently asked questions that I brought in some content, but mainly it's been Microsoft Research Center that's providing, I think, most of the content just to kind of understand what the problem is, just because that's been the attack vector. And so Microsoft led the investigation on that.
Excellent. So one thing I'm going to do after we're done recording is get some links from you. We'll put them in the show notes. People can reference those if they want to do further research and plus have some places to stay up to date. Paul, is there anything else on this topic that you want to cover at this point?
Yeah, I want to mention one thing that I felt really curious. So, or important to know is the way that FireEye, because FireEye is a company that detected this attack on SolarWinds, and they detected it because one of their users had registered, quote unquote, registered a new MFA device. And then when that user was contacted, they said, no, I do not have that cell phone. That's not my cell phone. I have no idea who did that. And so in this case, it's the MFA requirement that triggered the investigation by FireEye, which brought this attack that's been under our nose for many months now into play. So the value of MFA cannot be understated, and having an MFA roll out, if not as soon as possible, if you already don't have one, is very, very critical. Microsoft recommends it, and anybody else recommends it. And in this case, this is kind of what triggered the investigation and triggered this finding this attack. So use MFA.
Yeah, that was good advice before the attack. It's even better advice now. Use MFA. We kind of look at that today as like at the base level of maturity, right?
Yes. I think it's very, very important that we move away from password-based systems, and at least at the moment, using MFA is a transition for us to do that.
Well, Paul, if there's nothing else you want to share at this moment, I wanted to ask you if people want to reach out to you directly. What's the best way for them to do that?
Sure. So I'm on LinkedIn. I post quite regularly, perhaps too regularly, but you can reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'll happily converse with you pretty much on any topic and help out in any way I can.
And you're open to new connections and for people to, what do they call it? Not friending you, but connecting with you?
Yeah, of course. And I'm really big on education. So I've started some efforts to provide some collaborative education services to anybody that's interested. So I have, for example, like a cybersecurity 101 course I run on Sundays, as well as going to start up a CISSP group shortly. So I'm happy to help out or collaborate with anybody on their cybersecurity journey, regardless of where they're at.
And Paul's last name is Volosen. I'll have it spelled out in the title of the show, but it's Volosen. I got that correct, right, Paul?
That's right. Volosen is the Romanian spelling, or Volosen. So Paul Volosen, or Pavel Volosen, also, I sometimes go by that. That's actually my formal name, but Paul or Pavel Volosen, you can find me.
Really appreciate your time today, Paul. It's been great talking to you, and I'm sure all of our listeners really appreciate the research you've done and sharing that with them. I think in our last episode we said that was our last episode for the year, but hey, this is a industry that moves at warp speed. So one last episode we've recorded here today on Christmas Eve 2020, the year that none of us will be sad to see flip over in the calendar. So appreciate everybody listening. We'll be back to publishing the podcast in the new year. Hope everyone gets a little bit of R&R and comes back in 2021 fully refreshed. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.